Hi, you're listening to the Apologist Bookshelf, and this is Gary Zacharias. Boy, I'll tell you, J.P. Moreland is a prolific author, an excellent speaker. He's come to our church more than once, and what a witness for Jesus Christ. He's done so much for the kingdom. And he's got this book called The God Conversation, subtitled Using Stories and Illustrations to Explain Your Faith. Now, I've done, I think, a couple of podcasts in the past on this, and I like this book so much that I ended up doing a talk myself, just calling it Using Stories in Apologetics, and challenging all of us to think about examples and ways that we can clarify what Christianity is and what Jesus did. And we can do that through examples and stories. That's what people take away. That's what they remember. We can give them a big, long lecture on some theological topic, and it's not going to click. But if you tell them stories, wow, that's what we all take away. So the only thing I think I said before is that this book is, let me find the date here, 2007. So Moreland and his co-author, this time it's Tim Muehlhoff. So J.P. Moreland and Tim Muehlhoff. So to illustrate their point, they talk about Christian apologetics and offer arguments for the truth of Christianity, but they use stories, they use movies, and some of the stories, of course, will stay with us forever, but they may reference a movie that was big in 2007, but maybe some of us haven't seen or we don't remember it, and so there's a problem there, and you may want to update some of your thoughts, some of your examples, but the idea is wonderful, so I really like this book. So I want to do chapter 3 today. It's actually a second part of chapter 2, which is looking at the argument about God. How can God exist when there's so much evil and terror? And he calls this one, Can God Be Good If Terrorists Exist? And he starts with a story. I say he, both of them, Tim and JP. They both start with a story. FEMA, federal emergency people. When FEMA official Marty Bahamon, I think is the way you pronounce it, when they saw what Hurricane Katrina did, he was just overwhelmed. And he said what haunted him most were the faces of children. He said in one email to somebody, I can't get out of my head the visions of the children and babies I saw there, just sitting helpless, looking at me and hoping I could make a difference. And they say that, all of us were haunted by stories of suffering, like what came out of Hurricane Katrina. Of course, we could substitute more up-to-date suffering, couldn't we? The attack by the Russians in Ukraine, for example, and other more modern details of people being horrible to each other. So they said that, tragedies like Katrina bring up questions. Is God to blame for hurricanes and tsunamis? How does God respond to the death of children? Why doesn't God do more? And then they said maybe the most important of all, can I still trust him in the presence of evil? Of course, that's a tremendous question. Tim Keller has a book out on evil, pain, and suffering, and he says the same thing. He said, in many cases, it's easy to philosophize about God and the presence of evil, to say that you can have a God despite evil in the world. He said it's easy to philosophize, but when we're the ones who are suffering, we're the ones on the hot seat of life, it's a little harder. We need to trust God, and it's hard to do when we're going through the pain and suffering. Well, anyway, that was a separate book, but these are good questions they ask. So here comes their first question in this chapter. Who is to blame for hurricanes, tsunamis, and cancer? And they said, well, so who should bear the responsibility? They said, when insurance adjusters evaluate, let's say, a flood and all the devastation, they'll call it an act of God. So they said, shouldn't God shoulder the responsibility for these evils? He says, well, both of these authors say no. Christians believe humans were given the responsibility for being caretakers. So you have Adam and Eve, and what did they do? They rebel against God. And boy, did that bring problems. And the two major problems, we turned away from God. Then God judged us, but he judged creation. And we read in Romans 8 that our world was subjected to frustration and it longs to be released. And they said that one sign of this futility is how vulnerable people are and all of nature to natural disasters and disease. He said, the more we neglect our responsibility as caretakers of the earth, the more the earth declines. So our actions directly affect the planet we live on. So he said, you can see the movie Aaron Brockovich deals with something like this. I think I'll skip that one. It was a story of a town in Hinckley, California, about a town with people, pets and spouses and kids were getting sick and dying. They're trying to figure out what the problem is, and it ended up being the water. And there's a major corporation that had dug, I guess, thrown some materials into a faulty water well. Anyway, so they talk about that movie. So they said that movie illustrates that we're putting our interests in front of our responsibility to follow God and to take care of the world. So we've made the world really dangerous. And it says the earth was poisoned by our rebellion. He says, look at our tornadoes and hurricanes and cancers and all these tragedies. That's a reminder that we turned away from God. Let me add something here before we go on to a new point. Hugh Ross, who's an excellent astrophysicist and Christian, he heads up, or used to be he's the founder and was the leader of Reasons to Believe. Now Fuzz Rana has taken over and Hugh is retired. But Hugh Ross said, we complain about tsunamis, we complain about quakes and things like that, but the earth actually needs these things. You've got to have plate tectonics, bringing up material from very low in the earth's mantle. And so things like that are actually part of what's required to have life on this planet. So that's another way to approach this argument. Okay, then they move along here and they talk about AIDS activist and lead singer of U2, Bono. And he said, it's so discouraging. This is Bono now. He said, it's so discouraging when he's thinking about African kids and the fact that there's this racial superiority idea going on. So here's what Bono said. A prominent head of state told Bono, if we really believed these people in the developing world were equal, there's no way that we would allow 3,000 Africans, mostly children, to die every day from mosquito bites, while we have the medicines and technology that could save their lives. Says that's about as stupid as having separate drinking fountains for blacks in the 50s. He said it's racism disguised by distance. So now we're getting into the suffering of children. And by the way, I like they make a comment here. They said the effects on our spoiled world would be reduced if we would set aside all our sinful attitudes that we have if we really loved others. Remember in 1 John, we're supposed to love each other. We're supposed to care for others in the earth. That's what God commands. By the way, let me stop here just once or twice because almost every other page has a little section set off to the side that has really good things to think about. They call it digging deeper. And here's one I think is really valuable. It says, it's ironic, but there could be a problem of evil only if there's a God. Now, I said that. Now, doesn't that sound weird? There's only a problem of evil if there's a God. Why is that? Well, they said theists, people who believe there's a God, we do have a problem of evil. We've got to explain that. But atheists have a problem of goodness. How can there be goodness in a godless universe? If there's no God, the only answer is, why did an earthquake kill 30,000 people? The only answer is, why not? We have no reason to think that things like that shouldn't happen. The occurrence of evil wouldn't be strange. In a godless universe, hey, after all, just stuff happens, and that's the end of the matter. Well, we don't believe that. We don't feel that way. Okay, so they're moving on now, a new part of this issue of pain and suffering and evil. What about the suffering of children? And they mentioned that the atheist thinker Bertrand Russell said nobody could sit at the bedside of a dying child and maintain a belief in God. And they said, yeah, that's obviously heart-wrenching. By the way, again, if I can just plug in something, other people have said, well, you're an atheist and you're sitting at the bedside of a dying child. What do you say? You look at the parents and you say, well, I hope you had a good time with this child because you're not going to see him or her again. And you say to the child, I hope you at least had a few years of good thoughts and good life because it's gone. But a Christian sitting there is going to say to that child, you'll be with God and your parents will be with you. What a joy, because this life doesn't end at death. It continues, but not for the atheist. If you have a bad life and you're an atheist, if you got a disease when you're young, you're angry because that's all you have. Once the grave is there, that's the end. All right, well, anyway, so back to the suffering of children. They said that there are many theologians that believe that when a child dies, he or she is immediately ushered into God's presence. So that's, especially when you talk about an age of responsibility, that young kids just are not culpable for wrong actions, and they're judged morally innocent. And many believe that, and I think that makes good sense. John MacArthur says, little children are called innocent in Scripture for precisely this reason. They have no willful rebellion against God. They have no deeds of disbelief. So MacArthur says, yes, all children are born with a sinful nature, but they've never had a willful opportunity to exercise that nature with full understanding or a really deliberate rebellion. So I think that's a good point. Again, on this page, up in the corner, they have a digging deeper. And they said, God judged the creation as a result of the fall of angels and humans so that you end up with diseases and natural disasters. Why did God do this? First, we were supposed to be stewards of the earth. If it was the case that no ill effects came about when we abused that stewardship, we wouldn't really be stewards. But our stewardship is real. So as a result, when we didn't take care of things, the creation was subjected to frustration after the fall. And they said the other thing is natural disasters are warning signs that something's really wrong with this world, and this is not our real home. Isn't that a good point? Yeah, that's excellent. Okay, let's keep going. They call this the age of accountability and dinner decorum, right? So the idea is that when a kid has not reached yet an age of responsibility, God will accept them as is. But it says, here's another story, right? Here's an example. So you are sitting in the kitchen, you've been spending all day cooking, and it smells great. And the children come in, and everybody dives in. And they said, after one mouthful, your 5-year-old son looks up and says, "This food tastes like crap." Well, he had heard the word crap at school. He didn't really know what it meant, but he tried it out at the dinner table. So you as an adult have a decision to make at that point, right? Does this child really know how offensive that word is? Is he really rebelling against you and intentionally, shaking his fist, or is he just acting childishly? Now, if he was 12 years old, then he'd be held accountable. But as a 5-year-old, is he responsible? They said the same moral distinction you might make with this child that you have in your home is what God does in the case of each child that comes into his presence after a tragedy. I think that makes good sense. All right, next page. Again, they have a little block up at the top that says digging deeper. Some argue that the death of a child is just gratuitous. It's just senseless. It's evil. It's absurd. And they said, well, two things could be said. First, we have a limited perspective. We can't see in all ways when an event happens. So we're never in a position to say some evil is gratuitous. So example, so let's say there's a massive earthquake. If you say it's pointless evil, you'd have to know two things. The long-range balance of good versus evil that resulted over centuries after that event, and the long-range balance of good versus evil that would have resulted if there had never been this event. Only then could you judge, looking at those two things, that the event really was gratuitous. But as they said, who's got the slightest idea how to make such judgments? Only God has access to the facts. In other words, God knows a lot more than we do. We see that in the book of Job, don't we? Toward the end of the book of Job, Job and his friends have been trying to figure out, why is God doing this? Friends tend to say, it's your fault, Job. You must have done something wrong. Well, anyway, so they've been going back and forth. God shows up, and he says, let me ask you a few questions, Job. And he says, were you there when I created the stars? And he goes on, and Job has to say, basically, I'll just shut up. I don't know what I'm talking about. Well, yeah, that's the case, isn't it? We don't know enough to make these kinds of judgments. We don't know the mind of God. There's no way we can enter into something like that. Okay, here's the next section of the book. Why doesn't God do more? So they said, here's an example. I guess this really happened. There was a homeless man sleeping on a bench, and 3 teenagers came out with baseball bats, and they beat him, and they got it on a surveillance video. And the question is, why didn't God do something? How could he let this happen? Well, he said, first, how about this idea? Christ himself knows what it's like to be innocent and to be beaten by evil men. He's not immune to this man's suffering. And then God doesn't force us to be moral. The man was beaten by teens that had a choice. They could have been good, they could have been evil. They decided to be evil. Now, last thought there, God didn't stop the beating, but we can be assured that he will redeem this man's suffering. What would that look like? So they said, well, that's a true story. They said, we have a few clues. They said those 3 teens have been caught, and they're standing trial. They said it brought a lot of national attention to the plight of the homeless. Somebody who is an activist said this will shine a very bright light on an issue that's been camouflaged and buried for a long time. People put blinders on until it's right under their nose. So it did spark a national discussion of how to view the homeless. So it says God's redeeming of evil is not limited to this one case, and they give some great examples here. Now, I'm assuming a lot of you have heard of MADD, M-A-D-D, that's Mothers Against Drunk Drivers. They have over 600 chapters. They've been coming up lobbying for better legislation that would target drunk drivers and support victims' rights. So, do you know the story? I didn't know the story. MADD was founded by a woman named Cindy Leitner. Her 13-year-old daughter was killed by a drunk driver. And he'd had 3 previous convictions for drunk driving. So she got busy and did something about it. And so something good came out of something horrific. Here's another example, John Walsh. Have you heard of him? He's had a TV show for a long time. He's an advocate for missing children. He's testified before Congress. They ended up passing what was called the Missing Children Act in 1982. He had that TV show. I don't know if it's still on. It's called America's Most Wanted. Said it's been instrumental in bringing over 900 fugitives to justice. So why is he involved in this? His son was abducted, and 16 days later, this is 1981, 16 days later, they found his body. So he has gotten active and brought about some wonderful things. So I said, that's not minimizing the beating of a homeless person or the death of a teenage girl or the tragedy of missing children, but it said it can communicate to us that God is aware of evil and is actively committed to redeeming. Now, he said, both Tim and JP say, we can't always see how God specifically redeems evil. He said, but we can know that through the cross of Christ, God does redeem all suffering experienced by his followers. Okay, let's see. Yeah, we're getting close to the end of the chapter, so I'll keep going. Here's another question. Now, we've got all this suffering. Can I still trust God? So I said the reason many people keep their faith in God, even if they're suffering a lot, is they have a history with God. So over the years, they've experienced God's goodness, and they've come to trust him. I think that's really a good point. They have a story about this. There's a man, I guess somebody they really knew, his wife left him alone to do some quick shopping. So she's headed off. She says, I'll come on back in a few minutes, because they got an infant daughter. She was going to nurse the daughter. Well, a few minutes turned into 3 hours. The baby's hungry. He's looking at the clock. He's wondering, where is she? Maybe she ran into an old friend or she's on a shopping spree, but said he's worried, but he continues to believe the best about his wife. He says, I know the kind of person she is. She's not the kind of person to go off to a bar and leave me alone. She loves me. She cares about me. If she's later than she promised, she must have a good reason. And so just like that story, they said Christians stay connected to God. Many of them stay connected to God during times of suffering is because we're convinced God loves us and is committed to us. And again, that reminds me of Tim Keller's book, Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering. And he says, we need to trust God because we look back and see what God has already done for us. And we need to maintain that kind of trust. And so it says the scriptures tell us, back to the book here, the scriptures tell us exactly how God feels about evil. How does God feel about death, for instance? The scriptures, that's Ezekiel 33, say he does not take pleasure in the death of anyone, even the wicked. There's a statement that says God's heart was filled with pain in Genesis 6. Philip Yancey said, just reading that statement, Genesis 6:6 says, you behind that statement says stands all the shock and grief of God as a parent. Now, God didn't have just one child. He had the whole human race of rebellion to deal with, rebellious people. Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga, he says those who say God can't suffer are wrong. God's capacity for suffering, Plantinga says, is proportional to his greatness. It exceeds our capacity for suffering the same way as his capacity for knowledge exceeds ours. And it says the best thing, the best news, both JP and Tim point out, the scriptures show us God in action. He comes into this world and he strives against evil. Christ fed the hungry. When he witnessed injustice, he took action. Mark 3, Mark 11. He didn't just avoid the poor and oppressed, he sought them out. Matthew 9, Mark 5. So think about that occasion in Matthew 8. There's a man that has leprosy. Oh, I mean, we don't even appreciate how awful that would be to be a leper back in those days. It was just the most disgusting, awful thing. Well, he approached Christ in Matthew 8 and asked to be healed. Christ not only healed him, but he touched him. In those days, that would be just considered horrific. So it says Christ may not always physically heal us, but that same love and that same commitment that he showed to that man, they're available to all of us who pursue him. It says this love is what Christians cling to in times of suffering. By the way, they said, if you're wondering what happened to that guy and his wife, did she ever return? It says they never heard the end of that story, so they don't know, but they said to that man that told it doesn't matter why she's late, he trusts her. So it said, in this life, we're kind of like that man, we're left waiting. Now, sometimes we wonder why God doesn't show up, but we have to trust in the goodness of God as we wait to be reunited with him. All right, then they end with a story. This, like I said, this is really a powerful book because it tells these wonderful stories. Here's one that will never go out of date. So this is a true story. In West Virginia, there was a town in which 12 coal miners tried to shelter themselves from poisonous air. They were down deep in the mine. They set up a rescue effort, and families gathered. And it said there must have been a time when those trapped miners realized they wouldn't make it. Many of them wrote final goodbyes. And when word came that only one man survived, families were in shock. And they brought up the dying men, the dead men, of course, and they brought up their notes. And it said a brother of one of the deceased miners said the note from his brother was heartbreaking and deeply comforting. So here's the man, he was a foreman for this group. He was a man of deep faith, and he wrote his note on the back of an insurance form. And this is what it said: tell all, I'll see them on the other side. Oh, isn't that powerful? Tell all, I'll see them on the other side. Now, I've lost people close to me, and I'm sure many of you have. And as a Christian, that's our thought, isn't it? That's the thing that gets us through those hard times after the death. And so for Christians, we have the conviction that death is not final, that we will be united with those that have gone before us. It says the scriptures talk about it. John writes of a glorious reunion in heaven. God himself will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. So their point at the end of the chapter is, there is a problem of evil. Sure there is, but it's not permanent. We will be united with a good and loving God someday. So there's some hope for all of us. Anyway, thank you, and I hope this has been a good podcast. The book, again, The God Conversation. Thanks. Take care.